G-I-A-N-T 팽 워어 자이언트 팽 TV 워어 자이언트 팽 TV 놀랐다면 미안 이런 팽이 처음이지 자이언트 팽팽 에이 남극에선 혼자였지 남과 다른 덩치 원래 그래 특별하면 외로운 별이 되지 한국에서 노는 게 제일 좋은 펭귄 뿌르르 삐리리 암튼 스타라며 노는 건 내가 제일인데 한번 볼래? 아 그걸 하려던 건 아니야 자이언트 팽 TV 그래도 구독하면 내가 잘할게 난 너의 팽생 친구 자이언트 팽수 워어 자이언트 팽 TV 워어 자이언트 팽 TV 난 하나뿐인 210 자이언트 팽의 크리에이터 팽팽.
Now we have the opportunity to talk to Jinmin, an insider of Korean culture and pop culture. Why do you think does the generation Y or the millennials choose a character that is actually designed for younger generation as a speaking tube of their criticism and maybe not a figure that was directly designed for them?
That is a fantastic question. And I think there are several answers to it. But the main one being the fact that Pengsoo as a character deviates from a lot of kind of societal norms in South Korea, which, as you mentioned, can be quite rigid, given that South Korea is kind of one of the most homogenous countries in the world, especially when it comes to kind of its racial demographic. So Pengsoo, for instance, first of all, is 10 years old. It does have the voice of a middle-aged man, as some people like to describe it as, but it is 10. And I think a lot of audiences kind of see its kind of irreverent attitude and its ability to talk to elders without necessarily using honorifics, for instance, as a very freeing way of self-expression without some of the hierarchical concepts that are encoded in the Korean language. It is also fairly big, and there are many jokes made as part of the show where Pengsoo, for example, tries to sit on a chair but falls down. That kind of speak to its large body size. And in a society where body image, for instance, can become very fraught, given a kind of general, I guess, kind of in the media, like a lot of representation of very slim or small individuals, people see Pengsoo's body size and its kind of prideful or even funny acceptance of its own size as very, again, liberating. And, last but not least, and I think this speaks most directly to why Pengsoo has become so popular among millennials, particularly those who are working age, is the fact that Pengsoo has a very refreshing attitude to office life. It speaks to its bosses kind of in whatever way it wants to. It has told people, those who contact me on my day off will go to hell. And it says a lot of things that a lot of working age people in professional environments do think for themselves, especially in very kind of rigid environments, but feel afraid to speak. And Pengsoo kind of airs kind of those desires on their behalf. And I think a lot of people find that very kind of vicariously very pleasurable to watch. And so that's why a lot of people have kind of called for Pengsoo to become president or the workers' president, because it is able to kind of express their desires so well. And so I think for all these various reasons, Pengsoo being this figure that kind of challenges a lot of these strict norms, it has become immensely popular among Korea's millennial population, but also I think a broader population at large.
In how far or in which way are the generations structured in Korea by any political dimension? Because if I observe the narrative of generations, for example, in Germany, there are a lot of romanticized moments of rebellion. For example, the generation of 1968, which is said to be a generation that kind of fought against the old Nazis in the institutions, or I see something similar, like this narration of newness and of modernity and of freedom in the storytelling of Woodstock in the US. How do the generations and maybe their differentiation work in Korea if the conflicts are not so easy to articulate?
Generational issues in South Korea are incredibly complex and fascinating, especially because Korea developed so rapidly over the last 70 years. So in a sense, two generations that are otherwise consecutive have experienced completely different socio-political environments. And so in South Korea, that has kind of reflected itself in some political divisions as far as the generations go. So my father growing up would tell me a lot about his generation in the 90s would be called the 386 세대, or the 368 generation, the 3 standing for in your 30s, the 6 standing for, the 8 standing for in university in the 80s, and the 6 standing for and born in the 60s. And that was actually a fun fact, is it's named after the Intel 386 processor, and people just kind of adopted that name for the generation. But that generation became kind of known in the 90s because it represented a generation of people who came of age in a time where there was a lot of political upheaval. After the coup led by Park Chung-hee in 1961, there was a period of incredibly rapid economic kind of development that was soon followed by kind of autocratic rule. And my dad, for example, who went to university in the 1980s, was involved in a lot of pro-democracy protests, kind of pushing back against governments like his. And so that generation now is called the 586 generation because they are in their 50s. But that's a really interesting kind of demarcation that shows a generation that was caught between, the tail end of the Korean War and also the kind of beginning of economic modernization in South Korea. And now, obviously, like any other country, we also have our millennials and our Gen Z, and there are tensions between all of them, right? Like the millennials kind of really dislike the boomers because they think that they are too conservative. There's a term called 꼰대, which stands for like stickler or conservative, or someone who tries to impose their opinions on other people, that is often thrown around in South Korea to refer to boomers. And then, like baby boomers think that millennials are lazy because they think, at your age, I could work this many years and buy a house, but you don't have a house and you don't have a job. Those tensions you can see also in the United States, and I'm sure in Germany as well. But in South Korea, they are especially prominent. And because South Korea is a country where technology plays such a huge role, obviously a lot of younger people in Generation Z, or I guess even my generation, grew up on a lot of the internet. And I think a lot of older generations also see some kind of negative influences reflected in that.
I was wondering how older generations, like even older than the millennials, even older than the millennials who are about 20 to 30 years, react to this phenomenon.
It's actually really interesting because Pengsoo does have a big fan base among those in their 40s and 50s as well. There is a fan cafe, and in Korea, internet cafes are kind of sometimes used as a reference to online websites where a lot of people gather and kind of post their thoughts on different forums, a little bit like Reddit in the US context. But I think the original Pengsoo fan cafe on the internet has as many 40 to 50-year-olds as it does 20 to 30-year-olds, which I personally found fascinating, but perhaps not that fascinating because my mother, who is in her 50s, loves Pengsoo and watches Pengsoo every day for a lot of the similar reasons that younger people enjoy Pengsoo as well. My mother has told me she loves the way that Pengsoo embraces all parts of itself without being apologetic for it, and is able to kind of stand its ground even when, societal norms instruct it to be a different way. And my mother is inspired by that. So in a way, I think Pengsoo does have a broader appeal to all generations.
What does it change that Pengsoo openly calls and presents himself as a non-binary person, or as a non-binary penguin in this case?
So the producer of Pengsoo, the person who came up with the series, is a woman, and she kind of has been very vocal in the past about issues of female representation in the media, but also kind of more generally challenging some of the gender norms that have been for a long time accepted as the normal up until now. And she gave an interview with, I think it was a publication called Woman News in 2019, where she said that she wanted to use Pengsoo as an opportunity to break some of the gender stereotypes that she would see in the media. So it was a very intentional decision on her part to create Pengsoo as a character who does challenge gender norms and gender assumptions in South Korea, which is a country that is progressively becoming more inclusive of like a spectrum of LGBT identities, but is still not fully accepting, in the sense that same-sex marriage remains unrecognized, and I believe still no anti-LGBT discrimination laws in place. So Pengsoo, in a way, I think in the same way that he, or it rather, appeals to millennial populations for being who it is without shame and in fact with pride. I think that also bleeds into the realms of kind of gender identity and also gender expression, because Pengsoo, you know, again, despite having the voice of a scruffy middle-aged man, which is how a lot of people describe it, wears dresses, wears hair clips, and generally doesn't really have any kind of aesthetic that it goes by all the time. And I think it allows the South Korean population to kind of understand that, look, there are many different ways of expressing yourself physically, even despite what gender you might present yourself as. And that really, even gender aside, you can be whoever you want to be in whatever way and still be loved and accepted for it. Something that I think is important to note is the fact that Pengsoo is a penguin. And I think that makes it a lot more, in a sense, its queerness a lot more palatable to audiences. Whereas I wonder if Pengsoo was not a penguin and was in fact a person, whether it would have, whether its queerness would be kind of interpreted in the same way or as kind of accepted so wholeheartedly.
외로운 별이 되지 한국에서 노는 게 제일 좋은 펭귄 뽀르르 삐리리 암튼 스타라며 노는 건 내가 제일인데 한번 볼래? 아 그걸 하려던 건 아니야 자이언트 팽TV 그래도 구독하면 내가 잘할게 난 너의 팽생 친구 자이언트 팽수 와우 자이언트 팽TV 와우